properly. The wrong glasses on. Yeah, good.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So, I understand that you are a psychotherapist and that you were first working with a different method, and then you start studying and further developing the well, with the perspective of the identity trauma. Is it that correct?
Yeah.
In this research, what I like to do, or what I'm trying to find, is the pattern or your life experiences that led you to develop or to incline for this line of work.
That's a big question. Well, I didn't even think about becoming a psychotherapist until I was, let's see, in my 30s, mid-30s.
Mm-hmm.
So before that, I was doing all sorts of other things. I did all sorts of things. But I never felt really that what I was doing was what I really wanted to do, but I didn't know what I really wanted to do. And as mad as it may sound, when I was in my 30s, I didn't really know what therapy was. I really didn't. And then I was living in Sydney in Australia, and there was a lot of new age stuff and change stuff going on there. And I ended up in a couple of Gestalt workshops. So Gestalt is a form of psychotherapy. You may know that. And I was interested. I got interested. At the same time, I also got interested in acupuncture.
Oh.
Yeah, so I then left Australia and came back to England, and I started a training in acupuncture. And then for some crazy reason, I also started a training in Gestalt psychotherapy at a training institute in London. And because I didn't have a degree, they required that I do a counseling training as well. So for some while, quite mad, I was doing 3 different trainings all at the same time. But of course, as you probably know, the underlying ethics, if you like, and ethos of all are similar. Mm-hmm. So I got interested in that way. And in fact, I practiced acupuncture for 10 years alongside being a therapist. And then in the end, I just decided, no, I was much more interested in therapy than I was in acupuncture. And acupuncture just seemed like such a vast topic. I thought if you're going to be a good acupuncturist, you really need to focus on that alone. And I was more interested in therapy. So I guess that's sort of an answer to your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you were having these different trainings, but they were all related to helping or supporting people in their health.
Well, actually, in a way, not. And I think this is the interesting thing. In a way, my interest was in myself. Mm-hmm. In a way, my interest got started by some things that happened in the workshops that gave me insight about myself. So in an interesting sort of way, I certainly in the beginning, it's bizarre really, helping other people was not the idea. Somehow I'm helping me. And yeah, that's interesting. Yes.
Thank you for sharing that with me. And how, now that you've been working in psychotherapy, how do you see these events developing? Like from working for yourself to then working with other people? How did it change?
Well, I think when I trained as a psychotherapist, that was the late 1980s. And I think there were 2 things. One was it was a very popular profession to get into at that time. There was a lot coming up at that time. just at the beginning of the emergence of childhood sexual abuse, things like that. It was a very rich time at that point in the history of the development of therapy. And so I thought that was quite exciting. And then there was also something for me that had been there all my working life, right from when I first started work, was I actually always wanted to work for myself. I always wanted to could I find a way out of working for anybody else? And becoming a therapist seemed like a very good way of doing that. And it also held some fascination for me in terms of myself and in terms of the general thinking about therapy. So Gestalt therapy particularly I found very fascinating, very interesting. But then, of course, it developed from there, because then I got in contact in the mid 1990s with a German man called Bert Hellinger and something called Family Constellations, which you may know about.
Yeah.
That got very interesting. That piqued my interest. And then in about 2004, I met this man, Franz Rupert, whose work I now do. And I've been there ever since, really, working with trauma, psychological and emotional trauma.
And you're not working with family constellations anymore?
No, I haven't done for years. There were things about it. Do you know about family constellations?
I have a very general understanding of them, but never trained them.
Yeah, well, the practice of it I found fascinating, but I was not so keen on the background thinking and the man himself. I felt a bit suspicious of that. But so I kind of did that for a while. And then when I met Professor Rupert, Franz Rupert, whose work I do now, then I really felt like, yes, this is somehow over all this time, this was where I wanted to be. This made sense to me in a way that it's like, I think that in general, I think people's life is like this. You're young, so you have a way to go in doing this. I'm old now, but I think there's a way in which somehow you don't really know quite where you're going. I think we follow our nose, we follow what interests us and what stimulates us. And then there comes a point when we think, yes, now I know what it is that's important. And that's where I feel I am now. Yeah. I feel like I finally, it took a lot, got to a place I thought, yeah, now I know what's important. Yeah.
Could you please describe me a little bit more how was this feeling of now I know?
Well, I would put it a different way. I would say that all the way through studying as a Gestalt therapist and studying with family constellations up until this, there were always things that didn't quite make sense to me. Or there were always things that I thought, no, that's not quite enough. It's not quite getting to the place. So one way in which I can say that is that I get a lot of people come to me now. Sometimes they're therapists, sometimes they're not. But it's very common for me to hear someone say, I've done years of therapy. I've done 10, 20, 30 years of therapy, and I know there's something that hasn't quite got there. That I recognize, because I think it was the same for me. I always felt like there's something else, there's something missing, there's something we're not seeing, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Yeah. And so when I got in touch with the work that I now do now, it is so logical and it makes such sense to me, and it's so rational. It's not in any way like you have to say, you have to, how can I put this? You have to say something that actually is not solid and on the ground, you know. It's very difficult for me to explain. But I think there is a point at which you think, yes, this makes sense. This makes sense of me. This makes sense of what I see in my clients. This makes sense of what I see in the world. This makes sense. I mean, I think some people may get that sort of experience, for instance, if they follow something like Buddhism, and they suddenly see, yes, this makes sense to me. Yeah, this is not my way, but for me personally, I've dabbled in lots of things, dabbled in Buddhism and all sorts of things like that. but it's all come to this point now where I feel like this makes sense to me. This is where, yeah.
And how was the process of, I want to use the metaphor of clearing up the path, of saying, okay, I know about acupuncture, and I know about Gestalt, and I know about family constellations, but now I want to focus my professional also career on this. So there was a process or establishing a new practice, or I don't want to say branding, but that's kind of
nothing like that. It was, I mean, the thing that Professor Rupert was interested in when I met him in 2004 was trauma. Mm-hmm. And what I think is that understanding trauma, as I now understand it through working with Professor Rupert, understanding trauma makes sense of everything. Mm-hmm. It makes sense of mental illness. It makes sense of physical illness. It makes sense of people not being able to be successful in their lives. It makes sense of people having repetitive failed relationships. It makes sense of life. And for me, the thing that really, if I want to pinpoint it, made the difference to everything was taking this thing, trauma, that was out here, that in a way everybody was kind of avoiding because it's scary.
Yeah.
Saying it's central. This is what's absolutely central. It makes sense of our politics. It makes sense of our society. It makes sense of what's happening out there at the moment with the COVID-19 and all our panic. It makes sense of everything. And that was the thing that made me feel like, yeah, now I know where I am. Now I know where I am and I know what I'm doing. And I mean, I've written about it. I've written quite a lot about it, and I'm in the process of writing another book at the moment. And one of the things that I did in writing the book before was I looked at the history of the study of trauma. Mm-hmm. And the first idea of trauma was way back in ancient Egypt and in ancient Greece, and they called it hysteria. And you may have heard this. And then in the mid-1800s, Freud, along with many other people, was a student in Paris, and they started to study trauma. Now, what's really interesting to me is that they were studying what is trauma, how does it work, how does it affect people. That was in the mid-1800s. Yeah. And when I studied psychotherapy in the late 1980s, nobody talked about trauma. This is how much we have avoided it. Mm-hmm. Even the psychotherapy profession has avoided it, and still do to an extent today. And that for me is, that's why it's making it central. It's not been easy. It's not easy for us because it's a scary topic. Yeah. But that was the thing that made everything make sense to me, was understanding what trauma is, understanding how it works, and understanding actually how central it is to our lives. Traumatic experiences. We've all had them. Yeah. For me, reading your book, I have it right here. That one, yes. Was really eye-opening in many sense. But I was also very curious about, you are describing something that personally I was not thinking about it. That we have trauma, but also even before we are able to understand it, we are able to verbalize. We are even in a very early development age. And for me, that was also like, oh, wow. Yeah. So could you please elaborate a little bit more? I think that's right. I think your reaction, oh, wow, is the reaction we all have when we suddenly realize that it can happen even before we have any kind of voice. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the reaction. Sorry, I missed the question because I was just wanted to say, yeah, I think that is the reaction. Oh, wow. Really? Yes, that makes sense. And how these, because I'm building up on the idea of how people who are healers working, supporting in any kind of
stage, how these persons that decide to work with others, they need to, or we need to understand trauma in these terms. How important will be that?
Well, I think it's crucial because I think it's central. And I know over the years, many competent practitioners in a whole range of disciplines doing all sorts of different things. But if I see that they don't understand trauma and they don't make trauma central, then I think it's dangerous, actually. I think it's actually dangerous because it's so easy to re-traumatize someone if you don't understand the nature of trauma in the person. So at the same time, I do think that many practitioners of different healing disciplines, if they do understand trauma and make it central to what they're doing, they can still work in their discipline. But you see, it's like, for example, in psychotherapy, if the therapist is not thinking trauma, and if they're also not thinking pre-verbal or even pre-birth, then it doesn't come up. Then they are satisfied with the client talks about what they can remember. So it means an expansion of perception to include an understanding of trauma and to include an understanding that we are alive from the moment the sperm and the egg come together. And therefore, if we're alive, we have experiences.
Yeah.
And then, so long as you have a discipline that can access that, and just talking from intellect does not access that, that's part of the problem. But if a body worker, for example, has these things in their perception, they could probably, a cranial osteopath who understands trauma and understands pre-birth could probably work very well. It's the not having it as a central feature of their thinking, I think, that's the problem. Yeah. And it's dangerous. I think it's dangerous. Because it's not, it's not understanding the real vulnerability of the person they're working with.
I think this is a very also exquisite part of the theme. How the person who is working with other person as a responsible, how this dynamic should be, how this interaction is affecting both sides.
Yeah, are you a therapist?
I did study psychology, but I'm not a psychotherapist.
Okay. So, say your question again. Say the question.
How the interaction between the person who is supporting and the client, how it affects both ways.
Yeah. It's a complicated question. On one level, I would answer it's crucial. It's crucial the state of the person working with the other person. It's crucial their own inner clarity, psychological clarity, and their understanding of the issues at stake, which I would say is trauma. That's crucial. Then there are different ways of working. So most talking therapies are, even psychoanalysis now, are generally functioning on thinking about the relationship between the therapist and the person, and transference and these kinds of issues, which you're probably familiar with. That involves the therapist in the therapy, so that the therapist becomes an active part of the therapy. I don't like that. I don't agree with that, because I think that the problem is not an external thing. The problem is an internal thing. The problem, as I see it, if one is traumatized, one's split. Then the problem is the relationship with myself, is the fact that I'm split and I'm not in contact with myself. And the therapist, being in contact with a therapist, can only be a substitute. It's not the real thing. And so the therapist comes in as a substitute. And, transference is all about the therapist being seen as a substitute mother or a substitute father or whatever, and working through that. But I think it's a blind alley myself. I think it's So I think about myself. I mean, in a general sense, I'm a therapist, yes. But what I actually think I do is I facilitate the person to explore their own psyche themselves. So I have an idea about how you can do that, and I set that up, and I say, but I'm always behind them. I'm sort of like here. They're the ones who are doing the work in a way.
Yeah.
So I do think that therapy, conventional talking therapy, is very vulnerable to encouraging the client to be dependent on the therapist. That's not helpful. That's not helpful. Yeah. Because it's exacerbating the victimhood of the client. And victimhood is all about trauma.
Yeah.
Right? Helplessness and victimhood, that's what trauma is. And of course, we all experience trauma at some point, but it's not now. Now we are able to heal ourselves. We're able to do the work ourselves. Yeah. Yes, I think a therapist, a facilitator or practitioner is necessary to help facilitate the journey, but the client's in charge of their own exploration, in my view. And I'm now, having done it for years, I'm now quite suspicious of the therapist-patient relationship as being the crucible for healing. I don't agree with it, really.
And when is the client ready to go by itself, like by themselves, like stopping the work or stopping coming to the...
It's up to them. You see, one of my criticisms of conventional therapy is that the therapist holds a lot of power. And I mean, I was taught as a therapist that if a client wants to leave therapy, you try and persuade them not to. You tell them that they shouldn't do it. I would never do that now. I think I have to hand all authority for the person over to themselves. Yeah. I'm here to work with you, but you are the one who knows what's right for you, not me. Because to say I know best, I'm taking too much power, and I don't agree with that. Because the reason I don't agree with it is because the first situation of trauma was a situation where the person had no power. Somebody else had all the power. Therefore, I can't replicate that in the therapy. Does that make sense?
A lot of sense.
Yeah. Okay.
And that was my question related. My question was towards how you arrived to this point, but I can understand that it's also for your view of trauma, and you just explained it to me by understanding the dynamic.
Okay. If you understand trauma, then you have to work in a certain way, because you can't be too powerful, because it's re-traumatizing. It's just parallels the trauma. If the therapist is more powerful than the client, then you have a re-traumatization. Yeah, you're right.
Oh, this topic is really, really nice. I have another question. In your experience working with people, have you encountered patterns that, I'm going to say, in a week, 3 different people are coming to you with a very similar story, or things that suddenly you were seeing, oh, this is kind of like repeating itself? Do you have any experience, something similar?
Well, in a general sense, everybody who's coming to see me is traumatized. Yes?
Okay.
So am I. So in that sense, yeah, there are similar themes. So the issue of, you've read the little book, the issue of not being wanted, for myself, is extremely common. Now, I don't impose that on anybody. What we do is a process where they come up against it. It comes up in the process. I have to, I believe, approach the person and the process that they want to do with an open mind. And what I see is the same things coming up all the time. But then, of course, it's both general and it's also specific. So I could say that many of us were not wanted, really, for who we actually are. We were wanted for other reasons, or we weren't wanted at all, or whatever it is. But this is an intellectual concept. The experience of the person at that time, as a baby, if you like, of not being wanted, the terror perhaps that they felt, or the grief at not being able to have a good connection with the mother. This is very unique and individual to each person and specific. So you have both. There's a general idea, yes, this is common, but the individual's experience is their own.
Yeah. When I know that you have several books, and also you were translating Rupert's books.
Yeah, I edit the translations.
Okay.
Yeah.
But when I was reading this one, to be honest, it's the only one I have read for you so far, but I want to check the other one. I noticed that there is this kindness in the way that is described. There is this feeling or tone of saying, okay, this is, I know that there is a topic here. I'm going to place it here, but it's a very caring, the wording. And I'm wondering how you develop this tone, or how you came to this part of tailoring the book.
Well, I suppose there's two answers to that. One is having experienced my own trauma, then I know what we're up against. So then I understand and I suppose have available more empathy because I see it in myself. I know it in myself. Yeah. And I suppose knowing also what trauma is, or I do think it's knowing it in myself more than anything, really, having experienced it in myself and knowing what it's like to feel utterly, utterly helpless, and knowing what it's like to feel that my mother wasn't there. Actually having do my personal work with Franz Rupert myself, knowing those feelings, we're all in the same boat. There's no benefit or possibility of saying I'm separate from that. I'm in there too, with you, with everyone. We're all in the same boat. We're all probably, I haven't met anybody yet who's not traumatized. I mean, we're all in the same boat. There's no hierarchy.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to developing, or I don't know which is the best way to say it, is developing an empathy or touching or tapping into our own empathy. Which is how is it developing?
Well, if you remember in the book, the split, the little circle with the splits, okay, we can only be empathic, really empathic, when we're functioning from our healthy self. If we're functioning from survival, then we're too interested in keeping the trauma at bay, and we're not really available. So that image, that interesting image, it's structural in a way. So I could say that a person starting therapy probably has a large section that's the survival self, maybe a smaller section that's healthy, and a lot of dissociated and split off trauma. But the process of healing is, in order to make the healthy part bigger, need the survival strategies less, and to integrate the split off trauma. That's a very simplified version.
Yeah.
So therefore, if you have a process whereby you can generally over time achieve where one can function on a daily basis more from the healthy part, less from the survival, then you're empathic. Empathy is part of being healthy. I came across not so long ago, one of my distant colleagues was talking about classes for children on empathy, how to teach children empathy. And I thought, this is nuts. This is crazy, because a child, providing it's not traumatized, is naturally empathic. That's about being a human being, is being empathic. How have we got to a situation where we have to teach children to be empathic because they're so traumatized?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense that we have to teach. What we have to recognize is, why is it that they've lost this natural ability? What is it that means this child has lost their ability to be empathic? Because it's part of what being human is. It's also part of what a lot of the lives of animals is about. So animals have a capacity for empathy as well. We see this when we see, for example, elephants that grieve over a dead elephant. I mean, this is an emotion that is more than just, I have to get food and I have to mate and reproduce. This is emotion that is, it's empathy. So it's not just a human ability. It's natural in some aspects of nature. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is related to, okay, we talk about the therapist or the person who is guiding is ideally already doing the work to keep the healthy self always in the dominant part of the self. Which other strategies are desirable? Which parts of self-care or should be engaged in order to work with people?
You're talking about trying to instill something in someone that isn't there. So it's not that one has to try to function from one's healthy self more in one's life. It's more that one has to recognize that one's traumatized and work with that. And then just naturally the healthy part expands. And we don't need the survival strategies anymore. It's very logical in that sense. So I always think that if anybody says that they have to try to do something, they're going to fail. Because you either do it or you don't. If you have to try, then you're battling something. If you have to try, then you're battling a part of yourself that is not ready to do it or something. So, we just have to come into contact with what's split off in ourselves. Be willing to do that. It's takes courage, yes. Takes commitment to oneself. And of course, the problem with that is that for many people, their initial experience in life was nobody was committed to them. Nobody took them seriously. So then we have to learn the possibility to take ourselves seriously. And then, we have to learn that to start with. And then as we start to do that, then we do. And we take ourselves seriously. And that's part of the healing journey. I'm suspicious of behavioral stuff, of saying, if you look in the mirror and affirmations and things like this, I think you're not taking into consideration that part of you that doesn't want to have anything to do with that.
Yeah. In your eyes, how therapeutic field look in the future? How should they develop, maybe?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that what Professor Rupert has developed is the answer. Whether society takes it on or not is another question. Because his latest book that's out at the moment is called Who Am I in a Traumatized and Traumatizing Society? And so what he's looking at there is that our society is traumatized. It functions from a traumatized place, and it's continually traumatizing us. So, and I think if we are going to make any difference in a global sense or in a societal sense, we have to start to see how traumatized we are. So, for example, if we look at our politicians, how traumatized are they? And if they are traumatized, are they making decisions from their survival self?
Yeah.
How much healthy self do they have? I mean, a perfect example is Donald Trump, for example.
Yeah.
A highly traumatized man. I mean, he can't even make sense sometimes. These are the people in power. And of course, one of the problems is that people who want to be in power are traumatized per se. The want to be in power
Yeah,
is a survival strategy of trauma. How do we deal with that? I don't know what the answer to that is. I really don't. I see it and I see the problem.
Yeah.
So then, then if I start to think like that, it becomes too big. And I suddenly feel overwhelmed. I can't do that. Then it's easier for me. I come back down to the person that I'm talking to or the person I'm working with. That's all I can do. So I don't know. I do think it's the answer. Whether we'll do it or how we'll do it or whether we destroy ourselves first, I don't know.
And you as a practitioner, do you have a network of professionals that you work with?
Yes, we have a growing network of people who have come into contact with Franz Rupert and his work. And interestingly enough, so I sort of am the person in the UK. There's a sort of lead person, I suppose, in many countries, and I suppose, it here. But of course, something very interesting with the coronavirus is I've suddenly done a lot more online work, and I'm doing online groups every Tuesday. And I'm doing that because I can't do them physically, because I was doing them physically in London at my centre in London. I can't, so I'm doing them online. And suddenly I'm getting people from Hong Kong and from Singapore and from America and from Kuwait and all these countries where they know about the work, but there's no practitioners. So something really interesting, actually, that's for me, certainly, in thinking about this, that's coming out of this coronavirus thing. I'm doing just a whole heap of online work and finding it works really, really well. And being in my groups now, so the group I have tomorrow, I have people from about 5 different countries. And the other interesting thing is for the participants, that's also interesting, because they then start talking to each other from different countries and make contacts with people much beyond they would normally make contact with. And everybody has this central focus at our trauma together. And so somehow our community, if you like, is becoming online and it's becoming much more global. I think that's exciting. I'm very excited about that. Yeah.
It is, because it's like in a period of time where it looks like it's isolating, suddenly it's also opening other forms of interacting.
Exactly.
Are these sessions for people who are working as a professional or people who want to work on their own trauma?
Anybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, they are interesting. You mentioned that you are writing you are working on a new book.
I am, yes.
Is something that we can talk about it, or is still in development?
No, I can talk about it. I mean, all I'm trying to do is, if you get interested enough to read Franz Rupert's books, his books go in sequence, one after the other. And they cover a period of, let's say, now about 15 years, as he has developed the theory. So I say to students, if you're a serious student, read them from the beginning all the way through. If you just want to know where we're up to now, because he's been developing things all the way along, read the latest book, because he recaps the theory in the latest form. So that's the best way of doing that. So, but what I'm trying to do, because in an interesting way, Franz Rupert is a researcher. He's a scientist, actually, first. And he's devoted himself to researching trauma and attachment and developing the theory that he's developed. I'm a psychotherapist. So what I'm trying to do with my book is to write a definitive, to this moment in time, book about IoPT therapy for practitioners, for anybody, not just practitioners, but for anybody who's interested, looking at the whole thing as best I can, including the practice. And it will be the last book I ever write.
Why?
Because I think it will, because I'm trying to put everything into it, everything that I have into it. Yeah.
How is, because I mean, so far I have the joy to interview some healers,
Yeah.
and I have this part of saying, okay, well, you are working with people, but then you are also developing materials like a legacy, and I think that's like a two sides of the single coin. You leave a legacy by the clients you are working with because there's something happening. Sorry.
Yes.
And also you are having a material for people who want to read,
Yeah.
who want to work with. So how creating these materials is also transforming your practice, and how is also for you the process of creating the material?
Well, I think there's always a feedback, isn't there? So what I find is the more I write, the more I learn. Because I'm writing something and then I suddenly think, hang on, I don't quite understand this. So I have to really kind of think about it and understand it. I'm not interested particularly in a legacy. I don't really care about that. I recognize that if my books are useful, they will go on after I die, but I'm not really interested so much in that. What really interests me is being in contact with people. And I find that through the work that I do, I have the opportunity to come into really deep, good, emotional, touching contact with people, and I that's perfect for me. That's lovely. That's what I love. Yeah. I don't know if
Oh,
that answers your question suitably.
it does in the terms of yeah, it's not, if I understood correctly, it's not the book or the material is not the real point or the focus.
No,
It's
no.
about the,
I it's the point in actually I find interestingly I enjoy writing, which I never really thought before I started writing. I actually do enjoy writing. I enjoy writing ideas. I enjoy kind of sitting down and thinking, all right, I'm going to write about this particular piece and then just going with it and seeing what comes out. I found that actually quite creative and quite fascinating because I often find that I write something and I think, I didn't know that I knew that. That's really interesting.
so you learn also about yourself in the
Okay.
process. You learn also about yourself
Yeah,
in the
I
process.
absolutely.
That's
But
super nice.
I think we're always doing that. You're doing it right now as well, probably learning about yourself as well while you're doing this. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
um, I think so far I've been enjoying a lot of this conversation, and we are coming close to the last part. So, is there anything that you think we should talk about, or that I've been not asking, and you think that it's important to mention?
Yeah, I suppose one other thought. I think it's been very interesting. Your questions have been very good,
Thank you.
and they're not superficial questions. They're quite penetrating questions. I think that's good. Um, one of the things that I feel that kind of step back from therapy, is I think we're all traumatized. And I think we all have a right to know the truth about ourselves. And I think we're the only ones who can do that for ourselves. Nobody else can do that. And I think, we're not on this earth for very long. 75, 80, maybe 90 years. Maybe it gets a little bit more because we're so healthy these days. But in the great scheme of things, thousands of years, we're not here for very long. And I think it's the most important thing, I think, that we can do in this short time that we're on this world is find out who we are, is really come into contact with who we are. And we can't do that if we don't come into contact with the parts of ourselves that are traumatized and vulnerable. And I can't think that there's anything more important in our life than coming into contact with myself. It's better for myself, it's better for my partner, it's better for my friends, it's better for my children. If I'm true to myself and I make myself important and try and understand who I am. what else is there in life? Our profession is just something we do for a while. The most important thing is coming to know who we are. You know, over the temple at Delphi in ancient Greece, it had written over the top of it, "Know thyself."
Oh yeah.
That's it. I think that's all it is. That's it. That's the most important thing.
Thank you so much for doing this remark, because I remember that I saw it on your website,
Yes.
and I just let it, but it's crucial, because then why will be all these quests to think about the trauma, to integrate these splitting,
Yeah, exactly.
if we don't have that in mind.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much. That last part is really touching. Really. Is there something else that you would like to ask or to
No.
mention?
Yeah, I'm interested what you're going to do with this.
Yeah, I'm going to be very honest here. I am following the feeling of learning more about this um, process of
Yeah.
setting out a practice, of embracing a way of working with people and the values of the healers that are working with. And also, because I have this impression that it's not only the technique. I think at the end, as you mentioned it very clearly, that there is no, it's not only technique, it's what is supporting that, or what is motivating the work with. And by doing this, I'm learning also, well, first of all, I'm learning about the vast majority of approaches that we have
Yeah.
to work with each other. But most of all, I'm getting, I don't want to use the word contagious, but I'm getting inspired by this input of why and to think. And for me, it would be great when I manage to put everything in a single map, or in a single document, where I can show this experience and share this inspiration. Because for me, it's being very nutritive in terms of thinking differently about the person or the people who we are working with, or
Yeah.
uh, I hope to work with.
So that's
So
where you're going eventually. You want to work with people.
yes, eventually is what I want to do.
Okay. Yeah, good. What you can do if you want, I do these working groups every Tuesday online. If you wanted to, you can just sign up for what I call an attendance place. You can just sign up for that and just be there. You don't have to do anything and watch what happens. If you want,
Oh,
you can do that.
yeah, thank you. So
Yeah.
I can just log in via your website,
Yes.
and then I just.
Site and go to working sessions, online working sessions, I think it is. You can just, it costs you £20. I don't know what that's, how many euros. I don't know which way it goes, but yeah, you can do that and just watch. You don't have
Yeah,
to be part of it. You can stay out of it completely and just watch what happens if you want to do that.
yeah, I think that's also a part of the experience, and I'm really interested. I mean, learning more about the identity in general. So I think it will be really nice to
Okay.
see
Yeah.
also a session. So I'm very excited now.
Okay. Okay. Are you in Amsterdam?
No, I live in The Hague, but it's like
Okay.
25 minutes.
Yeah.
Because I saw that you are also coming sometimes to Utrecht, if I understand
Yes,
correctly. Yeah,
I do a supervision group in Utrecht, and I also do a training in Utrecht. But because we're all on hold at the moment, so it's not happening. And
yeah,
I sometimes go to Amsterdam as well. I've never been to The Hague, but I enjoy. I love Utrecht. It's beautiful, beautiful town, and I enjoy Amsterdam too. I go quite a lot. Yeah.
yeah. They're really nice. I mean, that's why I decided to stay around. But
Yeah.
yeah, I was checking, and I hope that at some point we have the. Well, I will bring this, and
Okay.
I will really like that. But well, we will see.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your experience. Thank you so much. I really
You're very
appreciate it.
welcome. It's been very nice chatting with you, Pedro.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye for
Bye.
Bye.